The study is mainly about modern slavery dynamics that occur in the Australian meat and cleaning supply chains. The main goal of the study was to give voices to marginalized workers, to show how factors like gender and race contribute to pathways into modern slavery.
Welcome everybody to Dirty Linen. My name is Dani Valent and here we are again, or perhaps for the first time, if you're a first-time listener, talking about issues in the food world with people who are engaged with them. I love thinking about all different parts of the world of food and drink. How does food get to our plates? What are the ingredients that are important to bringing it there? What is the experience of gathering together around food? We're going to deal with that in an unusual way today, talking to an academic about a study that she's recently done. So, who killed the pig that turned into the ham for your last sandwich? Who cleaned the floor where a lamb turned into your lamb chops? Who trucked the beef that ended up in the next pie you will eat? The longer and more complex the supply chain, the easier it is to lose connection with the way food gets to us. But it is so important to understand the way the food we eat is grown, is killed if that's necessary, and is delivered to us. Ema Moolchand is the co-author of a new study which has just been launched, Meet the Reality, Unpacking the Exploitation of Palm Scheme Workers in Australia's Meat Industry. PALM is PALM, and it stands for Pacific Australia Labour Mobility. All these things will become clear, but first of all, Ema, welcome to Dirty Linen.
Thank you so much for having me on this podcast, Dani. Very honoured to be here talking to all listeners about this issue.
Well, we are really honoured to have you here and thank you for the work that you've done. Tell us about the study. What does that title actually mean?
Mm-hmm. So the study is mainly about modern slavery dynamics that occur in the Australian meat and cleaning supply chains. So the project that we are going to discuss involves the study of working conditions of palm workers who work in abattoirs in regional Australia. The main goal of the study was to give voices to marginalized workers, particularly Pacific Islanders, to show how factors like gender and race contribute to pathways into modern slavery. So what we did was a deep dive into the previously unexplored aspects of their lives as meat workers. We wanted to get their views about their working conditions in order to design regulatory reforms. And I must say that the topic is deeply personal to me. I come from Mauritius and I have a slave descendant background. So both Mauritius and the Pacific Islands share similar histories of labor exploitation, which was shaped by colonialism. So Australia is home to both myself now and the participants, and our shared identity, I must say, as islanders really helped us to connect and made it easier for the participants to open up about their experiences, about all the issues that they discussed with me in the workplace.
Wow, Ema, that's what a powerful series of statements you've just made. That's really moving and powerful. I mean, when you say the word slavery, I think most people in Australia would think you were talking about a historical situation. And I guess some people might think, oh, there is modern slavery, but surely it's in countries far away from here. It's places that we don't understand, that don't have workplace laws that we hope we can rely on in Australia. But I mean, did you find that there are work practices occurring now in Australia which look very like slavery?
Yeah, actually, that's a very good discussion point, actually, because when we say modern slavery, it's a word that heavily used in discourse, and we tend to think about, like you said, historical images of workers being physically chained to their employers. But today, the chains that hold workers, they are more psychological than they are physical. And in Australia, we have the Modern Slavery Act, which defines modern slavery actually as an offense under the criminal code. And it includes a range of abuses like human trafficking, forced labor, and debt bondage. And when we look at the literature, there are terminological debates about the definition of modern slavery. And in our study, actually, we accept the definition of modern slavery as something that exists on a spectrum of exploitation, where the labor conditions often deteriorate gradually. Workers transitioning, for example, from decent work to exploitative conditions. And this is what we mean by modern slavery in our study.
So give us a sense of the landscape that your study took place in. Just like what kinds of abattoirs are we talking about? What kinds of what are the work practices and conditions there? What do they look like?
Yeah, so the main setting was the main project was about exploring the lives of meat workers who work in different abattoirs. Specifically in the study was beef and lamb abattoirs. And what did we find actually was darkness, I would say, which I would describe in more detail later. So most of our workers, they really spent long working hours at the abattoirs, which meant that they received little to no sunlight on most days. And what this study has found actually was important issues on the restriction of the freedom of workers on different levels where they work at the abattoirs. There was restriction, for example, on their freedom to change employers if they wanted to leave a bad employer, for example. Restriction on freedom to enjoy tenancy rights like other migrant workers in Australia, or even restriction on their freedom to enjoy more hours after work as they would wish. So most of the workers in our study that we interviewed, they also raised other issues that touch on the restriction of freedom. For example, they were pressed into unpaid team leader roles. They were often chosen for their good English, education, or having a driver's license. And what being a team leader meant was attending meetings, driving teammates to abattoirs early in the morning without getting paid for it. And those participants, they felt obligated actually to take on those roles because of their cultural background, where they are taught to support and not let down their community. So we came across these kind of issues and other common kind of issues which have been reported elsewhere, such as high rent for poor accommodation, where at the end of the day, they are getting excessive deductions from their salary. But overall, I would depict whatever we found was deception, where most workers, they felt that they were misled by the promises which were made during the pre-departure briefings in their home country. And that really did not match the reality of their work conditions here and pay in Australia.
So I think, Emma, let's perhaps give a little outline of the Pacific Australia Labour Mobility Scheme and because you mentioned, these broken promises or perhaps somewhat misty pictures of what people might expect. Just explain for people who don't know what the scheme is.
Yeah, so the PALM scheme stands from the Pacific Australia Labour Mobility Scheme. So the scheme itself is designed to help businesses to hire people from 9 Pacific islands to fill in labour gaps in rural and regional Australia. And it allows businesses to hire those workers from those 10 countries for low-skilled or semi-skilled jobs. And there are 2 types of work streams that those Pacific Island workers come to Australia under. A short period of 9 months or a longer period from 1 to 4 years. So what happened is the scheme itself is managed by the Department of Foreign Affairs and the Department of Employment and Workplace Relations. And the PALM scheme is actually a combination of 2 earlier programs, the Seasonal Worker Program and the Pacific Labour Scheme. So like I said, there are 2 different streams, but in our study, all the participants were on the longer stream, and they come to Australia under the scheme, under a specific visa called the 403 visa, and allows them to work for a specific period with their employer.
And, on this podcast over the years, we've spoken about chefs or other hospitality workers who are more or less indentured to an employer because of their visa conditions, it's very hard for them to leave. You know, you touched on the notion that one employer might be, a bad for whatever reason, and someone wants to leave, but because of their visa conditions, they are more or less trapped with that bad employer. And would you say that it's similar for these palm workers?
Exactly, yeah. There are many factors actually that puts the risk higher for the palm workers. And like I said, for the palm visa, when the palm workers arrive in Australia, they are placed in remote areas and they have to share accommodation with strangers. And this brings about this issue of social death where workers have limited social life. So right from the beginning until the expiry of their visas, they are bonded and very much dependent to their employer. And this brings about other risk factors which are linked to their contractual agreements as well, because participants reported signing 2 different contracts, one in their home country, one in Australia, and some of them were not given a copy of what they have signed.
Wow. And I think it's worth saying, some of these workers are highly educated, they have qualifications in their home country, but they've come to Australia basically seeking a higher pay grade, and they're there to send money home, basically, aren't they?
Exactly. And this is basically some of the stories of the people in our study. So we did like an in-depth case studies of 5 workers where we followed them closely. And all the participants in our study were male workers from the Pacific Islands. They were all breadwinners. They made the tough choice to leave the kids and the wives behind to come to Australia with only one goal, like most palm workers, which is to send money back home so their families back on the island can have a better life. And most of the participants in the study never entered an abattoir before. And I can give you a bigger background of how the participants, about the background of the participants in our study. For example, we have one participant who used to work as a loans officer in his country. He is married and has 4 young children, and now he works at a loading area at an abattoir. Similarly, we have another participant who worked as a police officer for 12 years back home. And he's currently in his 3rd month in Australia and working on the kill floor at the abattoir. And lastly, we have another participant who has an academic background in law and has previous experience working as a hotel receptionist. But now he's working in the burning room at an abattoir in Australia.
Yeah, there's some really striking testimony from some of these participants. I think, Emma, perhaps this is a good time for you to explain the way that you gathered some of this research.
Yeah, sure. So we chose a method called the photo voice method, and it is a form of action research. And it allowed the participants to use photos to describe the emotions and tell us about their perceptions of their realities. So worker voices are rarely heard and they do not really drive recommendations for law reform. But we believe that the best advocates for workers would be the workers themselves. So instead of doing just interviews, we allowed workers through this method to have an equal form of power to choose which scenario or which story they want to share with us. And so what we did was we gave participants prompts and we asked them to take photos. Photos not of their workplace, but about symbols or objects that could describe their conditions. And those prompts, those questions, they were framed around, for example, how would you depict your day as a meat worker? Or what is a challenging situation you would encounter at work? And this method was particularly useful for people who have low English levels or those who do not really trust people outside their culture to open up. And what came out of the study were really photos and stories which were powerful and sometimes haunting or poetic, I would say, using metaphors to describe their vulnerability. So using this method, our goal was really to see things through their eyes, raise awareness about their working conditions, and work together on finding solutions for those legal reforms. And I must say that the main benefit for us using these methods were to be able to deeply capture insights that participants had not shared with anyone else in Australia. And those photographs, they also gave them a powerful way to express emotions and also experiences that were difficult to put in words during interviews.
I have to say, Emma, that it's really striking and so powerful the way that you've done this. If I just can describe one photo number 6, Mafu as a tree, standing resilient to challenges but trapped due to visa limits. You look at it quickly and it's quite a mundane image. There's a tree, a leafless tree standing in amongst paving stones, and then there's just a brick building. I think it's a church, like a church hall, like a modern church, blue sky. There's really nothing. There's not much to this image, but then when you think about this leafless tree standing there, obviously unable to move, but resilient, the leaves are going to grow again come springtime, but the tree is powerless. I think it tells such a story, doesn't it?
It does. And I must say that the photo of a tree was something that was very recurrent in the photographs that the participants have taken. It was striking to see how they illustrated the feeling of being trapped through trees. Like you said, like they really emphasize on how they were resilient to all challenges that were thrown to them, and that they were trapped specifically because of the visa limits, which doesn't allow them to change employer without having permission, which I can discuss later. But this metaphor of using a tree was very impactful as well. Yeah.
Yeah, really amazing. There are lots of ways that we could, I suppose, tackle the question of why this is happening. But how do you think racism plays into these scenarios?
Yeah, the participants talked about racism and discrimination at work in several ways. And I must say that because of our shared identity, for example, they were able to open up on certain issues, especially for example, because they viewed me as someone who formed part of their community as an islander. They were very comfortable using words, for example, Palangi, which means white people in Pacific cultures. And they were very comfortable describing challenging situations about discrimination that they've experienced in the workplace. An example of that was there is an illustration for a photo from one participant where he used different heights of meat pallets and drums to show how Pacific Island workers feel like they were lower, like the lower drums, representing a lower status at work compared to other migrant workers on different visas. And this was specifically because they realized that people who come to Australia and work in abattoirs on different visas, they were able to get more training and opportunities for better pay and move up the ladder. But because of their restrictions on their visa, they felt like the lower drums being at a lower status at work and felt seriously discriminated because of that. And another issue that they mentioned was a racial stereotype, I would say, because of their physical build. They felt that they were given more work because of that, because they could do because of their physical build, and that's a racial stereotype that's built in, and this was heavily discussed in the focus group sessions that we did.
I mean, when we use the words slavery and in the context of Australia, there's another period of history that we could think of. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, it is true to say that Australia has a troubling history, I would say, when it comes to exploitation of Pacific Island labourers. For example, the literature talks about the blackbirding era, where since the late 1800s, industries in Australia have relied on labour from the Pacific Islands to fill domestic labour shortages in industries like sugarcane plantations. And during the late 19th and early 20th centuries, over 55,000 Pacific Island workers came to work in Queensland in exploitative and indentured conditions that were similar to slavery. But the palm scheme is different from those blackbirding practices. But there are still serious concerns, I would say, about how they are treated in Australia. And this is why our report highlights the need for Australia to break free from the dark history of exploitation.
So, what kind of recommendations come out of this really troubling study, Emma?
Yeah, so we made recommendations in 7 key areas, but the most important change that we want to see is increasing mobility for palm workers. Currently, there is a very peculiar situation where workers, like I mentioned before, if they want to leave an unscrupulous employer, they have to ask the permission of that employer to leave. They have to ask the permission of the new employer where they want to go. And they also need to seek clearance from the Department of Employment and Relations. And this is such an unrealistic expectation for most of us, let alone someone who is new to Australia without any connections. So that's one of the things that we are asking, increasing mobility and reducing that dependency on employers. And another recommendation that we also make is increasing the accountability of country liaison officers. Country liaison officers are the link between palm workers, approved employers, and the government. And the role of the country liaison officer is to provide on-the-ground support to workers and to facilitate their participation in the scheme. And in our study, none of the workers we spoke to had been visited by the liaison officer. Some of them don't even know that the liaison officer exists or what their role was. And there have been reports that some country liaison officers tend to act in the interest of the scheme to keep the scheme running. But this means problems are being overlooked. And it is for this reason that we are calling for greater accountability for these country liaison officers.
That's staggering that they're not visiting or advocating for the people who are most affected by the scheme.
Yeah, these were the reports. For example, we had participants from Tuvalu, and although on the government website there is the country liaison officer for Tuvalu, but the participants didn't know that there was someone actually appointed for their country.
So, I mean, this may not have been, in the scope of your research, Emma, but do you think this is careless? Is it happening intentionally? Is it because the supply chain is under so much pressure, things just get missed? Like, why do you think this is happening?
I think those dynamics are there because that's because we don't have we need a shift actually in the systems, in the way that the systems are structured. And I believe that those dynamics that appear to be exploitative, they become so because the workers are not given the proper oversight or support or accountability that they need. And we need to create a system that values those workers and upholds their dignity. So it's about creating the right frameworks and regulations to prevent abuse. And this is what we emphasize in the report.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. But you'd love it if if people just wouldn't allow this to happen because it was right. Like that, of course, dignity should be the first principle, and that someone comes here on the promise of being able to send back money home. So, of course, you make sure that can happen. The regulatory framework, in a perfect world would just be there to catch things that fell through gaps, hopefully unwittingly. But it seems, do you think that there is a way of employing overseas workers well, or do you think the dynamic is inherently exploitative?
Yeah, I think there is definitely a way to employ overseas workers fairly. And there are several ways in which this can be done, and some of them are covered in the report as well. And one of that would be a better collaboration, I would say, between the Fair Work Ombudsman, Anti-Slavery Commissioner Office, and these people can address those problems in a very efficient way. For example, we recommended establishing a dedicated palm worker support unit within the Fair Work Ombudsman, with multilingual staff who can provide assistance for workers in their preferred languages and also offer culturally appropriate support. And another suggestion was also to dedicate transport roles in relation to the issue I mentioned before about team leaders, where staff should be hired specifically to transport workers instead of leaving this responsibility to team leaders without compensation. And I believe those steps would go a long way in improving the current system and protecting workers.
Yeah, I guess so. What about, at source, like in the Pacific Islands? I mean, in the end, wouldn't it be better if people could find well-paid work close to their families?
Unfortunately, research has shown that there are not as many prospects as there are in those Pacific Island countries as there is in Australia. And one of the reasons is because most of the young people are leaving the Pacific Island countries to come and participate in those kind of guest worker programs. So there's really this kind of issue that's flagged in the literature, the brain drain issue, where the system is not ameliorating as well back there. So that's not really a prospect for them. That's why they're also considering of moving for getting a better life in a developed country.
Emma, what field is this in? Like, tell us a bit more about yourself and your studies, and what brought you to study this in particular.
Yeah, sure. So this study, I would position it into the socio-legal field of research. So the study is about modern slavery dynamics that occur in the supply chains. So this project that I discussed forms part of a bigger project where I'm analyzing also the modern slavery dynamics in cleaning industry. And there I compare those two dynamics that occur and both in the similar setting, Pacific Island scheme setting. And as I mentioned before, the reason I chose this study is because it's deeply personal to me. I also come from an island, Mauritius, and I have a slave descendant ancestry background. So this was the main drive behind me conducting this type of study here in Australia.
It's that cleaning one must be so interesting. I mean, as you mentioned, this is mostly male workers in the meat works, but I would assume the cleaning is gendered differently.
The majority of the workers in the cleaning industry are also male workers. So what I'm trying to explore is also masculinity and the effect of vulnerability. So I'm trying to explore the dynamics that evolve around how tough male workers, they also feel exploited in certain low-skill sectors. Hence the reason why I've chosen mostly male participants for the study.
Wow, it's so fascinating. So, Emma, as consumers, perhaps hospitality workers or diners, is there anything that we can do with our purchasing decisions to try to help this situation?
I think the listeners or even the consumers, I think they can start by informing themselves about the issues, about modern slavery issues and issues that palm workers face. I think a good point would be starting to read reports like the one we've published. And another way to be accountable or to hold the government accountable is by supporting campaigns which calls for stronger laws and better protections for workers. For example, recent campaigns include the Australian Workers' Union, which is seeking to abolish the 35% tax on departing palm workers so that they retain a greater portion of their superannuation. So public pressure, I think, can really make a difference in pushing for change. Getting involved, speaking out is crucial. And lastly, if I may share, we are also organizing a photo exhibition and a panel discussion to highlight the stories and the photographs taken by Pacific Island workers in Australia. And this photo exhibition is being organized with scholars from the Australian National University and Griffith University. And the event itself will take place on the 13th March at the Australian National University campus in Canberra, and the photos will be on display for 2 weeks. So I warmly invite all listeners to join us in Canberra and experience this impactful exhibition.
Wow, Emma. So we'll put links to the report and to the exhibition in the show notes of this podcast. Is there anything else that you'd like to say?
No, I just want to say thank you for giving me the chance to speak about the project and getting the workers' voices out there. Thank you.
Well, I think it's so important, and it's an election year, so I think it's gives us a good reminder to look at what the various candidates are saying about workplace practices, and particularly this scheme. It's really, I'm really blown away by what you've done, how you've done it, and I really hope that the recommendations are heard loud and implemented. Thanks, Emma.
Thank you, Dani.
This is Dirty Linen, and I'm Dani Valent. We air the issues that the hospitality industry finds hard to talk about, hearing from different people with unique perspectives. We want to hear from you as well. If you have something that needs to be said about a topic, get in touch so we can include your perspective. Contact us at dirtylinenat.deepintheweeds.com.au or hit us up on Insta at Dirty Linen Podcast. We can't wait to hear from you.
This